I was wondering why I was invited here. Just that my last book was like 3 years ago, and this book is at least a year away, so I'm totally off the reading circuit right now. But I found out that Nato Green is going to be doing comedy after me, right, up next. Kind of grew up on my comic books. When he was a little squirt, he found my work of 20 years ago was shaping his sensibilities. So I'm flattered, but I also now begin to understand why people used to burn comics in the 50s, because, you know, we laugh, we say, oh, they can't possibly really affect someone's worldview and upbringing, but we do have our spawn. And this is sort of about that. What I'm writing is a book. It's called The Undressing of America. It's coming from FSG sometime next year. If I finish it kind of soon, possibly the year after. It's been a sluggish project. And it's about that struggle between indecency and decency and freedom and control in the press, but it's especially about the power that the world of mass publishing used to have. And as we kind of are standing here at the end of the era of mass publishing, we're at a point where ink and paper are going off into some other role that I think is no longer the central role in disseminating information and worldviews and values. I'm liking looking back at the beginning. And this is kind of a boiled down piece of it, this big messy book in progress. We're starting around 1800. For 200 years, publishing had dawdled through a post-Gutenbergian pastorale. Paper was pressed from linen by hand craftsmen, then printed by independent journeymen with hand presses, at best putting out 100 pages an hour. Publications were for ladies and gentlemen, professors and Jesuits, burghers with heirs, not the rabble. Newspapers reached more people posted on walls than held in hand. For one reason, the clumsy floppy broadsheet became its standard form. Novels were often pre-sold by subscription, a sort of a Regency version of print on demand, and sales of 3,000 or 4,000 was considered a great success. Then came the revolution, a literary revolution brought not by the souls of poets, but by steam and steel, oil and acid. In 1814, the Times of London unveiled a steam-powered press that turned out not 100 pages an hour, but 1,100. 2 years later, that number was doubled. Meanwhile, pulping machines and acid baths were slashing the price of paper, and soon a wave of cheap newspapers and magazines and machine-stitched books began pouring over Europe and across the Atlantic to America. Penny papers and shilling novels filled with crime news and gossip and rambunctious fiction that appealed to shopkeepers, office clerks, mechanics, and seamstresses. This was something new. It was a mass medium. A generation grew up on it, shaped by it, making from it a new kind of culture, a mass culture. It worked the way mass culture still works. New media arenas aren't driven by artistic visions needing a venue. Machines make the arenas just as big as technology and the market will allow, and then the writers and artists fight to fill them and shape them. And as with every new medium since, the audience was in love with the medium itself. So Charles Dickens became its first hero, in part because he was the cheap press. In his Riverine productivity, his relentless surge toward undetermined endings, his cast of characters as motley and restive as his still evolving readership. And the readership was happy to slog through his swamps of page-filling dribble to reach those peaks of his, from which they could scan the sprawling new world that paper and ink were making them part of. America wasn't the first into the new mass medium, but we were quick and successful. We were a pirate nation. We flaunted international copyright laws, so the best and worst of Europe got here fast and cheap. Then the machines and the chemicals pushed us forward again. In 1843, a German engineer found a way to make paper out of wood. It was crap paper, brittle and dingy and so full of acid that it ate itself away. But it turned the trackless forests of North America into a cornucopia of cheap newsprint. And in the very same year, a young New York printer named Richard Hoe reinvented the wheel. A rotary press, a colossal spinning drum that could shoot out not 2,000 pages an hour, but 200,000. From the moment Hoe's drums began to roll, New York became the publishing center of the Western Hemisphere. Boston, Philadelphia, and Montreal became instant backwaters. Now the broad river of printed matter became a flood. Its waves began to beat at the high windows of the rich and influential. There were few controls on publishing in America. The press was free under law and had been constrained by tradition, decorum, and the expectations of its genteel consumers. But those constraints didn't hold when the half-lettered poor could buy penny newspapers, when even the growing masses of slum Irish were learning to read, when country boys newly away from their families went looking for excitement in the ramshackle newsstands that popped up like mushrooms on the city street corners, when hustlers and fly-by-nights saw a free press not as a sacred right but as a loophole and realized there was gold in the mountains of pulp. The new medium was a wide-open field. Immigrants and outsiders could plunge in and with enough daring and luck create fortunes. An Irish surgeon named William Haynes, unable to make a living at home, immigrated to New York, but found it hard to practice there too. So he thought he'd try to make some extra cash pursuing his hobby, pornography. Just as Richard Howe's new presses began to whir, Haynes hired a printer to bring out a $2 copy of Fanny Hill, a raunchy novel that had been passed among affluent hobbyists for a century, to see if there was a market for cheap mass pornography. And what do you suppose he learned? His first edition sold out, then his second, he reprinted more old dirty books in popular editions, then he found manuscripts arriving from readers wanting their own efforts to see print. Pretty soon Haynes had a mail order catalog and dozens of competitors. There at the corner of Ann and Nassau Streets in Lower Manhattan, a block from P.T. Barnum's Museum of Wonders, the modern porn industry was born, although no one's put a plaque on the spot yet. In the wake of the smut came frank sexual information, books like Secrets of the Wedding Night and guidebooks to local brothels. In one visit to a newsstand, a young man whose entire sexual education had been provided by the animals on his parents' farm could learn of the ecstasies of oral and group and anal sex and the addresses where they might be bought. Major newspapers ran ads for rubber novelties and medicines that claimed to cure social diseases and failures of male vigor. Sometimes, too, the smut turned confrontational. A novel called The Secret History of a Votary of Pleasure spent its first 30 pages excoriating the Congregationalist Church, the mother church of American morality, declaring that religious prohibition was the greatest possible goad to prurient thinking, before it finally got down to the 100 pages of nonstop frauding for which its buyers had been looking. When the custodians of American culture, the ministers, teachers, reform-minded politicians, looked out on this rising tide of cheap print, they saw it as part of a greater flood, a flood that threatened to sweep away an entire social and moral order. In the publishing capital itself, in New York, these were times of great scourges, epidemics of malaria and cholera fed by undrained swamps and open sewers, vast lawless shanty towns, the rioting poor, a monumentally corrupt city government installed by Tammany Hall and its army of immigrant voters, saloons, casinos, and whorehouses buying the police force and swallowing whole neighborhoods. A new urban mythology woven of tales of young men and women falling into dissipation, drunkenness, and crime. For years, the great crusade of the nation's moral leaders and reformers had been the abolition of slavery. With the end of the Civil War, those leaders brought their energies back home. Reform movements swept New York. One organization that particularly concerned itself with the spiritual and physical health of the generation of boys and men who would be building the post-war nation turned its eyes on the lurid press. The debasing influences of these publications on young men cannot be overestimated, they said. They saw the future of a generation and so a civilization seeming threatened. And so the first great culture war in American history was launched between a ragtag militia of smugmongers, smutmongers, and yellow journalists and the muscular troops of the YMCA.